It's 3:17 a.m. You're lying there in the dark. The room feels colder, emptier. The silence is deafening, like it's pressing down on your chest. You reach for your phone instinctively, but you already know there's no new message, no call coming through. And yet you check anyway. That ache in your heart, it's not just a metaphor, it's a real, invisible wound. A wound no one can see, but you feel it with every breath you take. Why does it hurt this much? Why does losing someone we love tear us apart so profoundly? You're not bleeding, no bones are broken, but it feels like a part of you has been ripped away. People will tell you to move on, to distract yourself, to stay busy. But what if I told you that the key isn't to run away from the pain, but to turn toward it? To understand it, to sit with it, and through that, to heal in a way that leaves you wiser, softer, and more awake than you've ever been. For over 2,500 years, Buddhism has quietly explored the deepest corners of human suffering. Not just the grand tragedies of life, but these private, intimate wounds too. The ones we carry in our hearts. The ones we're too afraid to talk about at dinner tables or with casual friends. And breakups, well, they're one of those pains most people underestimate. But the Buddha saw it clearly. He saw how attachment creates suffering, how craving for permanence in a world built on constant change is a trap we all fall into. And it's not just ancient philosophy. It's your story. It's mine. It's every heart that's ever longed for someone and lost them. You see, a breakup isn't just the loss of a person. It's the death of a future you imagined. The vanishing of routines, inside jokes, silent glances, and a certain kind of safety. It's waking up to realize that the version of you who existed in the context of that relationship is gone too. And what makes it even harder is that nobody prepares us for this. Our culture celebrates falling in love like it's a fairy tale ending, but rarely teaches us how to grieve when the story takes an unexpected turn. You might be wondering, can a spiritual path like Buddhism really help with something as raw, as ordinary as a breakup? The answer is yes. Not by pretending the pain isn't there, not by preaching toxic positivity or empty platitudes, but by offering you tools to hold your heartbreak tenderly, to examine it without fear, and to slowly, beautifully let it transform you. Pain is not your enemy. In Buddhism, suffering, what we call Dukkha, is the first noble truth, not as a punishment but as a teacher. Every wound, every disappointment, every silent night staring at the ceiling is a doorway. And on the other side of that doorway is wisdom. But to cross it, you have to understand why it hurts. Not on a surface level, but beneath all the stories you tell yourself about what went wrong. Beneath the blame, beneath the regrets. To touch the ache directly as it is. This is not easy work. It takes courage to sit with grief. It takes even more to ask yourself difficult, sacred questions. What was I really craving from this relationship? Was it love or was it safety? Was it connection or was it an escape from loneliness? Was I in love with them or with the version of myself I got to be around them? In Buddhist philosophy, our pain isn't caused by what happens to us, but by how tightly we cling to what we wish could be different. And in that clinging, we suffer. I'm not here to tell you to stop missing them, or to act like you're fine when you're not. In fact, I want you to do the opposite. I want you to feel it all, to let the grief run through you like a river, to be raw, unguarded, unapologetic about your sadness. Because only when you stop resisting it, when you stop pushing it away, does it begin to loosen its grip. Only then can you start to see the shape of your suffering clearly, and where there's clarity, there's the possibility of healing. Some wounds never fully close the way we expect them to. But that's okay. The goal isn't to erase the pain, but to transform your relationship with it, to let it humble you, soften you, open you. And strangely enough, this breaking open is the birthplace of wisdom. So if you're here, heart aching, replaying memories like old movie reels in your head, know this: you're not alone. And this moment, painful as it is, holds the seeds of something sacred. A turning point you didn't choose, but one that might just lead you home. In this journey we're about to take together, we'll explore ancient Buddhist insights, practical tools, and real stories of people who, just like you, sat in the ruins of a love story and somehow, piece by piece, built themselves a new life. Not by forgetting, but by awakening. And it all begins with understanding the true nature of our suffering. There's a question that sits quietly at the center of every heartbreak, every sleepless night, every moment we find ourselves staring into the dark. Why must it hurt so much to lose something we love? The Buddha, sitting under the Bodhi tree more than 25 centuries ago, asked the same thing, not just about love, but about life itself. Why do we suffer? Not occasionally, but consistently in countless forms. In the loss of lovers, in the anxiety before uncertain futures, in the emptiness we feel even in moments we thought should have made us happy. And his answer came in the form of a single word: Dukkha. Dukkha isn't just pain. It isn't just grief. It's the ache that hums beneath the surface of every human experience. The discomfort of knowing that everything we cling to will one day slip through our fingers. The unspoken tension of trying to hold onto something in a world made of change. You felt it, in the way a beautiful moment already feels like a memory while it's happening, in the way a love so tender can unravel in a single conversation, in the way even our own reflection changes year after year, and how no matter how tightly we try to hold onto youth, joy, or certainty, they drift. This is Dukkha. It doesn't mean life is miserable. It means life is unpredictable, impermanent, and ultimately beyond our control. And when we resist this truth, when we demand permanence in a world built on impermanence, we suffer. Think of a breakup. On the surface, it's about losing a person. But underneath, it's about losing the story you told yourself about forever. About believing, even for a moment, that something could be fixed, unchanging, safe. The pain isn't just about them leaving. It's about the betrayal of your hope, the crumbling of your certainty. The Buddha saw this pattern in every corner of life, not because the world is cruel, but because the world is alive, and everything alive is in motion. Every relationship, every emotion, every thought, like clouds drifting across the sky, like seasons folding into one another. Nothing stays. When we cling, we suffer. When we let go, we begin to heal. Now, letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending it never mattered. In Buddhist wisdom, letting go means loosening your grip on what cannot be held. It means seeing clearly that your pain isn't wrong. It's the natural consequence of attachment in a world made of change. And that clarity is the first step toward freedom. There's a famous parable in Buddhist tradition. A man is struck by a poisoned arrow. Instead of pulling it out, he insists on knowing who shot it, what kind of bow they used, what tribe they belonged to, what kind of poison it was. And while he demands these answers, he dies. We do this too after heartbreak. We obsess over details. Why did they stop loving me? Was it something I said? Were they ever really mine? Did they lie? Was it my fault? But Buddhism invites us to see the first task isn't to solve the mystery. It's to remove the arrow, to turn toward our pain, recognize it, and begin the work of tending to it. The story can wait. Because when we understand Dukkha, we realize our suffering isn't personal. It's not punishment. It's the texture of life itself. And in that understanding, something remarkable happens. We stop feeling like victims of our pain and start becoming students of it. Grief, after all, isn't a flaw. It's proof you loved. Proof you opened your heart to something fleeting and beautiful. And though it hurts, and it will, that tenderness is a sign you are still alive, still capable of feeling, still connected to this strange, precious, temporary world. What Buddhism teaches isn't how to avoid suffering, but how to sit beside it, how to see its true nature, to stop mistaking temporary loss as permanent devastation, to stop fighting the tides of change and instead learn to float with them. And in doing so, we find that even in sorrow, there is space. Even in heartbreak, there's room to breathe. You might not be ready to let go today. That's okay. It's not a race. Healing is never linear, never neat. Some days you'll feel light again, and others you'll collapse under the weight of a single memory. This, too, is Dukkha, and every breath you take through it is a quiet act of resilience. The Buddha didn't promise a life without grief. He promised a path through it, a way to understand it so deeply, so compassionately, that it no longer defines you. And as you begin to sense the shape of your own Dukkha, something subtle will shift inside you. Not a dramatic escape from pain, but a gentler way of holding it. And from that tenderness comes the next step on our path together. There's something strange about heartbreak. It doesn't just hurt, it consumes. One moment you're holding someone's hand, believing in forever. The next, you're tangled in a storm of desperate thoughts. Obsessing over what went wrong, chasing memories, pushing away the ache, bargaining with ghosts. It feels personal, intimate, unique to your story. But it is. It's part of a much older pattern, one that the Buddha called the three poisons. In Buddhist philosophy, the root of all human suffering can be traced to three toxic forces that cloud the mind and trap us in endless cycles of pain: craving, aversion, and delusion. They're not just abstract concepts. You've met them in the mirror, in your late-night thoughts, in every love you've clung to, every hurt you've run from, every lie you've told yourself to stay afloat. Let's meet them properly. First comes craving. In Pali, it's called tanha, meaning thirst. It's that restless hunger we feel for something outside ourselves. The desperate urge to possess, to hold on, to make something permanent in a world that is. In the wake of a breakup, craving sounds like, if only I could win them back, if only I could feel loved again, if only things could go back to how they were. It's not the love that destroys us, it's the craving. The belief that without this one person, this one story, we are incomplete. The more we feed it, the more it grows. Like drinking salt water, craving only makes us thirstier. It convinces us that happiness lies just beyond our reach, if only we could grasp a little tighter. Then comes aversion, the push to reject what we find painful, uncomfortable, or frightening. After loss, it sounds like, I hate them for leaving, I hate myself for trusting, I wish none of this ever happened. It's the knee-jerk reaction to numb the hurt, to escape it, to blame, to bury. But here's the irony: the more we resist our pain, the deeper it burrows. Aversion turns heartbreak into a cage, locking us in bitterness, resentment, and regret. We think if we can shove the pain away, it will leave. But pain isn't a guest you can evict. It's a teacher you have to face. And then there's delusion, the most elusive poison of all. Delusion isn't loud, it's quiet, subtle. It convinces us that we understand what's happening when in truth we're lost in a fog of assumptions. After a breakup, delusion tells you, they were my soulmate. I'll never love again. I'm unworthy. This pain will last forever. It paints your mind with half-truths and illusions. It convinces you that your suffering is eternal, that you're broken, that your story has ended. But delusion thrives in darkness. The moment you see it for what it is, a trick of the mind, it begins to lose its grip. The three poisons aren't unique to heartbreak. They're woven into the fabric of human existence. The craving for what we want, the aversion to what we fear, the delusion about what things really are. The Buddha taught that these poisons fuel the endless cycle of suffering. Not because we are bad or weak, but because we haven't yet learned to see them clearly. And clarity, that's where freedom lives. Imagine this. You're sitting by a river. You notice debris floating past, sticks, leaves, bits of trash. Craving is the urge to reach in and grab what looks good. Aversion is the impulse to shove away what disgusts you. Delusion is believing the river shouldn't carry anything at all. But the river moves, whether you approve of its contents or not. The wise don't fight the river. They sit, they watch, they understand. When we begin to recognize these poisons in ourselves, when we notice, this is craving, this is aversion, this is delusion, something miraculous happens. We stop being their prisoner. We stop reacting and start observing. This is the beginning of wisdom. Heartbreak doesn't vanish when you name its poisons, but it stops being a monster in the dark. It becomes a series of understandable, manageable passing experiences. Moments of craving, waves of aversion, clouds of delusion, all rising, all falling. And in between those moments, space, peace, a kind of soft, quiet strength. Buddhism doesn't promise you'll never feel heartache again. It promises you'll learn to meet it differently, not as a victim, not as an enemy, but as a student. And through those lessons, you begin to remember. You are more than your craving, greater than your aversion, wiser than your delusions. One breath at a time, you unlearn the stories that kept you trapped. And in their place, a new clarity begins to take shape. And as this understanding settles into you, something else becomes clear. Perhaps the pain isn't asking to be erased. Perhaps it's asking to be seen, held, and allowed to move through you like the river itself. Because in the tender stillness of your own awareness lies the path forward. Have you ever tried to hold on to a sunset? To freeze that one perfect shade of gold in the sky as if you could make it stay forever? Of course you have. Maybe not a sunset, maybe a kiss, a certain laugh. A morning in bed where everything felt untouched by the world. Moments like those, we ache to trap them, to bottle them up and keep them safe. But no matter how tightly we cling, they slip through our fingers like sand. Why? Because everything changes. In Buddhism, this truth is called anicca, impermanence. It's one of the most fundamental laws of existence. And yet, it's the one we fight against the hardest. When someone we love leaves, it's not just the loss we grieve. It's the crumbling of a story we told ourselves would last. The illusion that something, anything, could remain unchanged in a world built on change. But impermanence isn't a punishment, it isn't cruel. It's the very reason joy exists at all. Imagine if nothing ever changed. No growth, no healing, no sunrises, no seasons. The beauty of a cherry blossom lies in its brief, fragile life. The sweetness of a note lingers because it fades. We suffer not because things change, but because we expect them not to. After a breakup, we replay memories as if they could somehow bring back what was lost. We obsess over what could have been, what should have lasted. But every love, no matter how deep, was always destined to evolve, to shift, to end, or to become something else. We just didn't want to see it. The Buddha once compared life to a river, always moving, never the same in any two moments. You can step into the same water twice, but it won't be the same water, and you won't be the same person. When we resist this truth, we create our own suffering. When we accept it, we begin to discover peace. And here's the paradox. Impermanence is not just about loss, it's about hope. Because if the good moments don't last, neither do the bad ones. This ache you feel now, this tightness in your chest, those restless nights, they too are temporary. As real as they feel, they are only passing weather in the sky of your awareness. The rain doesn't apologize for falling, and it doesn't stay forever. The moment you start to see your pain, your longing, your loneliness as passing visitors rather than permanent residents, something softens inside you. You realize, I don't have to hold on to this, and I don't have to push it away. I can simply let it be and watch it move. Impermanence teaches us to savor what is beautiful without trying to possess it, to grieve what is lost without clinging to ghosts, to meet what is difficult, knowing it too will pass. It invites us to live more fully in each moment, because nothing we cling to will ever be exactly the same again. And strangely, that's what makes it precious. There's a story in Zen about a monk who, while walking through the mountains, encounters a hungry tiger. Chased to the edge of a cliff, he clings to a vine. Below him, jagged rocks. Above, the tiger's teeth. And then he notices a wild strawberry growing beside him. With one hand, he plucks it, and before the inevitable, he eats it. And it said he thought, how sweet it tastes. That is the wisdom of impermanence. Even at the edge of loss, there is something to savor. Not because it will save us, but because it reminds us we are alive. You don't need to run from change. You don't need to numb yourself to it. You can meet it like the monk with his strawberry, aware of the danger, aware of the sorrow, and still open to the sweetness that remains. Maybe right now, in the middle of your heartbreak, it's hard to believe there's sweetness left. That's okay. You're not meant to force it, but what you can do is notice. Notice the way the light falls on your wall in the evening, the warmth of tea in your hand, the sound of distant rain, small things you might have missed before. This is the quiet gift of impermanence. It sharpens your senses. It reminds you that this moment is unrepeatable, and because it will end, it matters. Even sorrow, when seen clearly, holds its own kind of beauty. And so, little by little, we begin to loosen our grip. Not because we've stopped caring, not because we've forgotten, but because we've remembered nothing is meant to be held forever. And in that release, a new kind of peace waits for you. Sometimes, when the heart breaks, the mind refuses to sit still. Thoughts race, memories loop, and emotions rise like sudden storms. It feels impossible to find peace when your inner world won't stop trembling. But what if, instead of trying to outrun the pain, you simply turned toward it, not to drown in it, not to indulge it, but to meet it the way you would a frightened child, with tenderness, with patience, with presence? This is where the practice of mindfulness comes in. In Buddhism, mindfulness, or sati, isn't about emptying the mind. It's about seeing things as they truly are in each moment without judgment. You don't need to pretend you're okay. You don't need to suppress the ache in your chest or the anger or the loneliness. You only need to notice it. Ah, you might think, this is sadness. This is longing. This is the tightness in my throat when I remember their voice. When you name your experience, when you simply witness it without trying to fix or flee from it, something incredible happens. The emotion softens. It loses its grip. It transforms from an overwhelming wave into something you can gently hold. Sit down wherever you are. Close your eyes if you wish. Feel the air moving in and out of your nose. Notice the heaviness in your body, the tightness in your chest. And then with each breath, gently repeat in your mind, this too belongs. I don't have to fight this. It's okay to feel this. You're not your thoughts. You're not your pain. You are the space that holds them. And within that space, you'll find something deeper than sorrow, something unbroken, steady, vast. But mindfulness is only one part of healing. The other is something that feels almost impossible in the aftermath of a breakup: loving kindness. Known in Buddhist tradition as metta, it's the practice of cultivating unconditional goodwill, not only toward others but toward yourself, especially toward yourself. Because if you're like most people after heartbreak, you've probably been cruel to yourself, blaming yourself, replaying mistakes, wishing you were different, better, braver, more lovable. But suffering multiplies when we abandon ourselves in pain. And so, metta begins here, by placing a hand over your heart and whispering softly, even if you don't fully believe it yet, may I be kind to myself. May I find peace. May I heal. At first it might feel awkward, forced, but stay with it, because loving kindness isn't about how you feel in the moment. It's about planting seeds in the soil of your awareness. Seeds that, with time, will grow into something unexpectedly beautiful. Once you've offered these wishes to yourself, you extend them outward, to someone you love, then to someone neutral, then even to the one who hurt you. May you be safe. May you find peace. May you heal. This doesn't mean you excuse what happened. It doesn't mean you invite them back into your life. It simply means you release yourself from the prison of bitterness. Because hatred, like heartbreak, is a weight we carry alone, and metta is the practice of setting it down. When combined, mindfulness and loving kindness create a kind of inner alchemy. Together, they remind you that pain is part of being human, but it doesn't have to define you. They teach you to stay with what's real without drowning in it. They help you hold your broken pieces not as failures, but as proof you dared to love at all. And if you can stay present, if you can soften your heart even in sorrow, you'll start to notice a lightness, a breath, a tiny, almost imperceptible warmth at the edges of your grief. It grows slowly, like dawn over a cold horizon. But it grows. This is not about forgetting. This is not about replacing sadness with false joy. It's about learning to carry your loss with grace, to offer yourself kindness where once you offered blame. to notice the aching emptiness and breathe into it until it feels just a little less sharp. The practice isn't perfect. Some days will hurt more than others, but mindfulness and loving kindness aren't about perfection. They're about showing up for yourself, again and again, in whatever condition you find yourself. And over time, you'll realize you're no longer standing in the wreckage of what was. You're standing in the quiet possibility of what could be, not by erasing the past, but by meeting the present moment by moment with tenderness. In the hush that follows, something new can begin. There's a strange silence after heartbreak, not the absence of sound, but the quiet inside you, where words used to be, where dreams used to live. And when that silence comes, it can feel unbearable, like standing in the ruins of a house you spent years building with nothing left but echoes. But within that emptiness lies a doorway, a chance not to forget what was lost, but to rebuild differently, more wisely, more gently. The Buddha called it the Eightfold Path, not a rule book for the devout, but a living, breathing way to walk through life's darkest hours. A path we all have access to, if only we're willing to take that first trembling step. It begins not with action, but with clarity. The moment you realize that suffering isn't something happening to you, it's something born from the way you cling. Cling to a person, to a future that never arrived, to an identity built around someone else's love. This is what the Buddha called right view, seeing reality not as we wish it to be, but as it truly is. Understanding that everything, no matter how precious, is impermanent. That pain arises because we resist this truth. And when you truly see that, something shifts. The sharp edges of loss soften, not because the wound disappears, but because you stop trying to hold on to what's already gone. From there, the heart naturally turns to right intention. What do you choose to cultivate within yourself now? Bitterness, endless self-pity, or the quiet wish to heal? It's not about pretending you're fine. It's about deciding in each small moment to plant seeds of kindness toward yourself, to stop fueling the fire of blame and instead whisper to your heart, "It's okay. You are safe now." And then there's how you speak, both to others and to yourself. Right speech isn't just about avoiding harsh words in conversation. It's about noticing the way you narrate your own life inside your head. How often do you call yourself unworthy? How often do you replay the final argument, tearing yourself apart for what you should have said, should have done? The path invites you to pause, to replace cruelty with honesty and tenderness. Not flattery, not denial, just simple truths. This hurts, but it won't hurt forever. And as your thoughts begin to heal, so too do your actions. Right action asks you to care for yourself, not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in small, consistent ways. Get out of bed, drink water, walk beneath the trees, say yes to a friend's invitation. Refuse to let pain dictate your every move. It's in these humble moments that you reclaim your life, piece by piece, breath by breath. And you begin to notice the environments you allow yourself to stay in. People, spaces, conversations. Right livelihood isn't only about your career. It's about choosing what you consume emotionally, spiritually, socially. After heartbreak, we often surround ourselves with reminders of loss, scrolling through old messages, listening to sad songs on repeat, drowning in memories. But there comes a time when you must choose what lifts you, what reminds you of your own worth beyond the story you've been trapped in. And then, slowly, gently, comes right effort. Not the kind that exhausts you, but the kind that nourishes. The effort to turn toward beauty, even when your heart isn't ready. The effort to notice a sunrise, to hold a kind word in your mouth instead of bitterness, to forgive yourself on the days when you fall back into grief. Because healing isn't a straight line, it's a spiral. And the effort isn't to avoid falling, but to rise again, each time a little softer, a little wiser. And always you return to right mindfulness, to the practice of being here. Not in the past you can't rewrite, nor the future you fear, but in this breath, this step, this quiet moment. Notice your sadness, notice the ache in your chest, notice the way sunlight spills across the floor. It sounds small, but it is everything, because every time you return to the present, you loosen the chains of memory. You come home to yourself, and finally, there's right concentration, the gathering of your scattered thoughts into stillness, not to escape, but to remember the calm beneath the storm, through meditation, through prayer, through the simple act of sitting with your own heart, no matter how broken it feels. In that stillness, you begin to see something astonishing, that even in your grief there is peace, that even after everything has fallen apart, you remain, and you are enough. The Eightfold Path isn't a doctrine for saints. It's a roadmap for anyone who's ever had their heart broken, for anyone who's ever stood in the wreckage of a life they thought they knew and asked, "What now?" This is What Now, a path made of small, compassionate choices, of gentle effort, of quiet courage. And though it may feel like you walk it alone, you never truly are. Every heart that's ever ached has walked it too. And every step you take brings you closer to a life not free of pain, but rich with meaning. And so we arrive at the final turning, not an ending, but a tender, quiet beginning, a new way forward, a homecoming to the self you lost and are just now beginning to remember. Somewhere along this path, you realize you're not the same person you were when the heartbreak first came. You've shed skins you didn't know you wore, laid down burdens you thought you'd have to carry forever. And though the scar remains, it no longer burns. It no longer defines you. You start to feel something unexpected, not the old version of happiness, built on conditions and attachments, but a quiet, steady peace, a tenderness for your own heart, a gratitude for simply being here, alive, breathing, witnessing the sky shift from night to dawn. This is what the Buddha meant when he spoke of awakening, not a mystical escape from life, but a coming home, a remembering of your true nature, not as someone broken, but as someone beautifully human, flawed, grieving, resilient. You see now that pain was never your enemy, it was your teacher. The one that cracked open the walls around your heart so light could finally get in. And perhaps the most extraordinary thing is this: the person you lost, the future you mourned, was never truly yours to keep. Nothing ever is. And somehow, in accepting that, you're free. Free to live this life not by clinging, but by loving. Not by fearing loss, but by embracing each fleeting, precious moment for exactly what it is: impermanent, imperfect, and infinitely valuable. You realize that your worth was never tied to anyone else's gaze, never measured by whether you were chosen or left behind. You were enough long before the relationship, and you remain enough here and now. And from this place, something begins to stir, a quiet desire, not to fill the emptiness with distractions, but to understand it, to turn toward it, to live with both hands open, welcoming what comes, blessing what leaves. This is your new beginning, not a restart, but a rebirth. You walk forward carrying not the weight of what was lost, but the wisdom it left behind. You learn to greet your own reflection with kindness, to let silence feel like a companion, not a curse, to laugh not because life is perfect, but because it's beautifully unpredictable. And you'll falter. Of course you will. Some nights will be heavy. Some mornings you'll wake with old ache clinging to your chest. But now you know how to meet it, not with fear, not with shame, but with steady breath, with mindfulness, with compassion. You'll sit with your grief like an old, familiar friend. And you'll say, "You can stay as long as you need. I'll be here." And over time, grief will visit less often. And joy, quiet, ordinary, breathtaking joy will return. Not the reckless kind born of craving, but the kind that appears when you see a bird lift into a sunrise, when you feel rain on your skin, when you realize you made it through one more day. This is awakening, not a destination, but a way of being. And so, as this chapter closes, remember, you are not broken. You are breaking open, not lost, but rediscovering yourself. And this pain, the one you thought might destroy you, has become the doorway to a deeper life. A life where suffering isn't denied but understood, where love isn't attachment but freedom, where every heartbreak, every ending is the beginning of something holy. So breathe, stand where you are, and take your first step forward. This is your path now, and you are ready.